Imagine spending billions of dollars building a refinery, only for a relatively inexpensive drone to travel more than 1,000 miles and strike one critical piece of equipment. That's no longer hypothetical. From Russian refineries and Ukrainian power grids to tankers in the Red Sea and energy assets around the Persian Gulf, some of the world's most important energy systems have increasingly become part of the battlefield. This wasn't how the era of precision warfare was supposed to unfold. The assumption was that better surveillance, precision-guided weapons, and increasingly sophisticated drones would make warfare more contained, allowing armies to identify and strike military targets with extraordinary accuracy. And in one sense, they have. Weapons have become dramatically more precise, but the battlefield has also become much larger, because the same technology that allows a military to target an individual vehicle can also allow it to identify and strike a specific transformer, a refinery unit, a fuel depot, or a pipeline hundreds, even thousands of miles behind the front. Increasingly, the targets aren't armies. They're the systems that keep modern economies running, and nowhere is that transformation more visible than in energy. So this is the precision paradox. Energy infrastructure has always mattered in war. Oil fields, fuel depots, railways, factories and power stations have been attacked in conflicts for generations, and civilian infrastructure isn't automatically immune from attack under international humanitarian law. Under certain circumstances, infrastructure can become a military objective, although the requirements of distinction, proportionality, and precaution continue to apply. But something important has changed. For several decades, there was at least a broad expectation that basic civilian infrastructure would retain some degree of protection. That expectation appears to be eroding. There has been research from West Point's Modern War Institute having described what is happening as the emergence of an age of energy warfare. Their argument is that the informal sanctuary once afforded to critical infrastructure is disappearing. And look across today's conflicts, and it's easy to understand why. Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukraine's electricity system. Ukraine has launched an increasingly sophisticated campaign against Russian refineries, oil depots, and export assets. In Sudan, power stations, substations have been attacked during the country's civil war. In the Red Sea, the Houthis attack commercial shipping, which have disrupted one of the world's most important maritime trade corridors. And across the Persian Gulf, in the ongoing US-Iran war, energy facilities, tankers, pipelines, even infrastructure supporting water supply have become part of the strategic contest. These conflicts are very different, but they share one important characteristic. Energy is no longer simply something armies need to fight wars. Increasingly, energy itself is part of how wars are fought. Let's focus on Ukraine and the drone revolution for now. Nowhere has this technological transformation been clearer than in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, drones were already important, but over the past several months, their role has expanded dramatically. At the front, small drones are used for surveillance, targeting, and direct attacks, but increasingly, long-range drones are operating far beyond the battlefield itself. And that's where the energy story becomes particularly important. Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure roughly doubled between 2022 and 2024, and they'll doubled again in the following 2 years. Early in the conflict, successful attacks on distant Russian energy infrastructure might have occurred maybe a couple of times a month. But in 2025, there's estimates that they were averaging around 12 times a month. And these attacks have become increasingly precise. Drone operators have reportedly been instructed to target particular components within refineries, including individual furnaces, chimneys identified as especially vulnerable, rather than simply trying to hit the overall facility. Now that is an important development because you don't necessarily need to destroy an entire refinery to disrupt its output. A refinery is an enormous, complicated system. Damage the right processing unit or electrical connection, a pumping station or a compressor, and a relatively small physical strike can potentially cause a much larger operational disruption. Ukraine has demonstrated just how far this capability can reach. In recent months, Ukrainian drones and missiles have targeted refineries, oil depots, export facilities, and elements in the Black Sea tanker fleet. One refinery, supplying a significant share of Moscow's fuel, was reportedly knocked offline. Think about what this means. Infrastructure that once might have been considered safe beyond the battlefield is no longer necessarily beyond reach, and that changes the economics of warfare. And this is the asymmetry that makes energy such an attractive target. Because a modern refinery can cost billions of dollars. An LNG terminal is expensive, a large power station is expensive, but perhaps more importantly, these are fixed assets. You can't move a refinery because intelligence suggests someone may attack it next week. You can't hide an LNG terminal. You can't relocate major power stations. And many energy systems contain critical nodes where relatively limited physical damage can produce disproportionate large consequences. This creates a remarkable asymmetry. The weapon used in such an attack can cost a tiny fraction of the economic damage the attack ultimately creates. There is the direct cost of repairing the facility. Then there are the second-order effects, lost production, replacement imports, greater freight costs, higher insurance, pressure on strategic reserves. A drone doesn't need to destroy a refinery permanently to have strategic value. It may only need to interrupt production repeatedly enough to impose costs on the adversary. And that is one reason energy infrastructure has become such an attractive target. A drone that costs maybe a few $1,000s can bring a refinery that costs billions to build to a complete standstill. And remember, energy systems are networks. This is another vulnerability. Modern infrastructure does not operate in isolation. It operates as a network. Electricity powers pipelines. Gas supplies power stations. Power stations support telecoms. And in some parts of the world, energy is critical to producing something even more fundamental, water. Across parts of the Gulf, desalination supplies a very large proportion of drinking water. Those desalination facilities depend on energy. So an attack on electricity infrastructure can potentially become an attack on water infrastructure. An attack on fuel supplies can affect electricity. This is why the consequences of infrastructure warfare can be so difficult to contain. A strike on one part of the network can cascade through several others. And it also means that energy security can no longer be thought about simply in terms of whether enough oil, gas, or power exists. An increasingly important question is, can that energy actually reach the people who need it? So this is where we move from energy infrastructure to energy markets, because what we have seen around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz isn't simply the targeting of energy infrastructure. It is something broader. This is the weaponization of energy flows themselves. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy choke points. This gives enormous geographic strategic value to Iran. Sometimes simply making passage dangerous enough can alter behavior of ship owners. Cargoes get delayed, insurance premiums rise, governments become nervous about security of supply, and suddenly a military confrontation thousands of miles away begins affecting the price of what we pay for gas and petrol anywhere else. This is why the Russian President Dmitry Medvedev reportedly described Iran's ability to disrupt Hormuz as the strategic Hormuz weapon. The weapon isn't simply the physical strait itself. The weapon is the world's dependence on what passes through it. What we're seeing now isn't just simply energy warfare. It is increasingly an energy war, a conflict in which military actions are designed not only to destroy physical assets, but to influence global fuel supply and prices. That distinction is worth thinking about. During the conflict, Iran targeted military facilities. It also targeted and threatened refineries, gas fields, pipelines, export infrastructure, shipping. Meanwhile, the US and Israel have also struck Iranian energy infrastructure and facilities. So the battlefield isn't just geographic, it's commercial. Commodity prices affect consumers. The US understands this, Iran understands this, and this is why the actions from both of them create an entirely different form of leverage. A militarily weaker country doesn't necessarily need to defeat a much stronger adversary conventionally. If it occupies a sufficiently important position within the global energy system, it may be able to impose economic costs well beyond the battlefield. But Iran has demonstrated something even more strategically important. A military power and economic vulnerability aren't always distributed the same way. A country can possess overwhelming conventional military superiority and still remain exposed to disruption in global energy markets. Remember, energy warfare is no longer just about bombs and drones. When we hear the phrase energy warfare, it's easy to imagine a drone hitting a refinery, but the modern energy system can be disrupted in several ways. The first is obvious: physical infrastructure, like we discussed, refineries, pipelines, LNG terminals. The second is transportation and choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, shipping lanes. Energy can exist physically and still become unavailable if it cannot reach its destination. The third is economic and financial infrastructure, sanctions, price caps, export controls, financial restrictions. Russia provides a particularly clear example in this case. The struggle over Russian energy isn't confined to attack on refineries. It extends to tankers, insurance, maritime services, and the shadow fleet Russia uses to move sanctioned oil. And there is a fourth dimension: cyber infrastructure. Modern power grids, pipelines, and industrial facilities increasingly depend on digital control systems. Disrupting those systems can potentially interfere with energy supply without physically destroying the infrastructure itself. So the modern energy warfare operates across multiple layers: production, infrastructure, transportation, finance, and information. And increasingly, those layers interact. The hidden problem with this is diversification. For years, the standard answer to energy insecurity has been diversify. Buy from multiple suppliers, use different fuels, build strategic reserves, secure several shipping lanes. And diversification absolutely matters. But the conflicts we're seeing today reveals a weakness in that thinking. You can have multiple suppliers and still be exposed to the same underlying point of failure. Imagine buying LNG from several producers. On paper, your portfolio of suppliers looks diversified. But if a significant proportion of those cargoes must travel through the same maritime choke point, you still have concentrated risk. The same is true of electricity. You may have multiple sources of generation, but they may rely on the same transmission infrastructure. Different gas suppliers may use the same pipeline. Different oil contracts may depend on the same export terminal. So the next generation of energy security has to think not only of diversification, but about correlation. Not simply how many supplies do we have, but we have to think about what common infrastructure do all those suppliers depend upon. And what happens if that infrastructure becomes unavailable? So this is where we go from efficiency to resilience. Because for decades, much of the global energy system was built around efficiency, optimized infrastructure, reduced spare capacity, build global supply chains, move energy from wherever it can be produced in the most cheapest manner to wherever it's needed. In normal conditions, that makes economic sense, but redundancy often looks inefficient right up until the moment you need it. A second pipeline that spends most of its life underutilized may suddenly become invaluable during a crisis. This is what we mean by optionality, and in a world where energy infrastructure is increasingly part of geopolitical conflict, optionality becomes a form of insurance. That creates a difficult question. How much resilience are we prepared to pay for? Because resilience isn't free. More infrastructure costs money. This optionality will cost more money. The economics of energy security may therefore be changing. Efficiency still matters, but increasingly, resilience has economic value of its own. So what's the main takeaway from this? The precision paradox. So perhaps the original promise of precision warfare wasn't entirely wrong. Technology and AI really did make weapons more accurate. Drones can now travel extraordinary distances and hit remarkably specific targets with pinpoint accuracy. But what we failed to anticipate was what that precision might eventually be used against. The battlefield hasn't simply become more precise, it has expanded. A refinery thousands of kilometers from the front can now become part of war. A ship carrying oil passing through a strategic strait is now a target. A port, a pipeline, a power grid, a desalination plant, even the financial and digital systems that allow energy to move around the world. Sometimes a drone has to fight the right transformer, refinery, or shipping terminal. Iran doesn't have to control the world's oil supply to influence global energy prices. And a country doesn't necessarily need to lose access to energy production to face an energy crisis. Sometimes infrastructure connecting supply with demand simply has to stop working. That is the precision paradox. Technology has made warfare more precise, but the precision has not narrowed the battlefield. It has allowed the battlefield to reach deeper into the infrastructure we need for everyday life. And that means one of the defining questions of energy security in the years ahead may no longer simply be when and where will our energy come from. Instead, we need to ask, how resilient are the systems that allow us to get that energy? Thank you.